Hey everybody, I'm Todd Miller, and today I'm going to talk to you about macronutrients. Now, you may have heard the term macros and wondered, what is everybody talking about when they're talking about macros? So, anything that you put in your mouth, eat or drink that contains calories is a macronutrient. And specifically, we're talking about protein, fat, carbs, and alcohol. Now, micronutrients are things like vitamins and minerals, things that are critical for the diet and critical for optimal health, but they don't contain any calories, okay? Now, one of the things we often ask ourselves is there an optimal range for what these macronutrients should be? You know, how much fat, protein, and carbs should I actually eat? And I'm going to put up a table here. This table is from the Institute of Medicine, and this is representation of what's called the AMDR, the Acceptable Macronutrient Distribution Ranges. And this is what percentage of your calories should come from protein, fat, and carb. And we can see that for fat, we should be eating about 20 to 30% of our calories from fat. For carbohydrate, about 45 to 65%, and then protein between 10 and 35%. And you may ask yourself, are all of these macronutrients pretty much equal? And the answer to that is no. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have the calorie content for each gram of these macronutrients, and you can see that fat contains 9 calories per gram, while protein and carbs both contain 4 calories per gram. So fat is a much more concentrated source of calories. You know, a handful of nuts is going to have more calories than a handful of grapes, right? So when it comes to what these intakes should be, these are what those recommendations are. Now, many people will say, well, do these recommendations change when we try to lose weight? And we're going to talk about macronutrients in the context of optimizing body composition, which often includes weight loss. Okay. So I believe that of these 3 macronutrients, of protein, fat, and carbs, protein is really the most important. And the reason for this is that carbohydrate and fat are used as fuel. They're used to fuel the body. Protein is not. And let me give you an example or an analogy of what I'm talking about. Let's look at skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is basically the muscles that move you around. If we think of skeletal muscle sort of like a construction site, where the muscle itself is a big brick building, and that big brick building is being assembled by workers. And if we think about muscle, we can think of the bricks as being protein and think about carbs and fat as being the workers. So muscle is constantly being broken down and it's constantly being synthesized. And whatever your muscle mass is basically the sum of the synthesis rates and the breakdown rates. So protein itself, basically, we eat dietary protein, it gets broken down into amino acids, and those amino acids act as the bricks that are being reassembled to produce new muscle protein. And again, carbs and fat provide the energy that allows that work to happen. So we don't want protein to be used as fuel. The body can use protein as fuel, but it really doesn't like to, and we really don't want that to happen, okay? So imagine that we have our construction site, and imagine there's a strike, and now there's not as many bricks being delivered to the construction site, right? This is similar to what happens when we go on a diet. We go on a diet, we start decreasing the amount of food that we're eating, and if we decrease the amount of protein that we're eating enough, now the building materials that are necessary to maintain our muscle mass are not there in adequate amounts. So now our protein, our carbs and our fat are still going to build the building. They're still going to break down muscle and they're still going to build new muscle. But if the amount of protein coming in is less than the amount of protein that's being broken down, you're going to end up with muscle loss. And this is a very common thing that happens when people attempt to diet and lose weight. They lose a bunch of muscle. And this is really the kiss of death when it comes to dieting, because one of the primary predictors for whether or not you regain your weight after you lose it is how much of your weight loss came from muscle. So the more muscle you lose during a weight loss intervention, the more likely you are to gain that weight back. Okay, and the more likely you are to have even more fat than when you first started. And that's for reasons beyond the scope of this. But the point is, when you are calorie restricting for the purposes of losing weight, it's very important that you increase the protein intake to account for this. Another thing that leads to greater protein requirements is exercise, especially resistance training exercise. So if you are decreasing your caloric intake for the purpose of losing fat weight, and you are increasing your weight training for the purpose of maintaining muscle, which is what we recommend, in that situation, you definitely need to increase your protein because you have two things working against you. You have resistance training, which requires a higher protein intake, and you have caloric restriction, which requires a higher protein intake. Also, resist the urge to cut carbs when dieting. The body really likes to burn carbohydrate, especially the brain. And if you don't give the body enough carbohydrate, the body will make carbohydrate from dietary protein that you're eating. So you can see that this could be another potential problem. If you're dieting and your carbohydrate intake is also too low, then some of the protein that you're eating can potentially be converted to carbohydrate, which even further limits the amount of protein that's available for maintaining the muscle mass. And when we lose muscle mass during weight loss, we run the risk of our metabolism slowing, which leads to fewer calories burned per unit of time and fewer calories burned throughout the day, which makes it more difficult for us to stay in a calorie deficit and lose fat weight. So, when you are trying to lose weight, remember, try and keep your calorie restrictions relatively small. You don't need to be cutting to 1,500 calories a day. Keep your calorie restrictions small and make sure that with respect to protein intake, you're staying as close to that 35% of calories from protein as possible, and that will ensure that you're doing everything you can to make sure that your metabolism is running healthy and that you are preventing muscle loss during dieting. Thanks and good luck.